Okay, thanks very much. And again, just briefly for the purpose of recording, good afternoon, welcome to this event on China, the EU and the international human rights regime. I'm Mark Powsley, Dean of the School of Law at UCC, and I'm chairing the event. So human rights are increasingly a contentious global issue, with differences between authoritarian and democratic states being accentuated. China has often taken a line of a communitarian approach rather than an individual approach to rights is its preference, and also that social and economic rights should have priority over civil and political rights, which tend to be the ones that are prioritized in the West. And obviously, China, like many other developing states, is concerned about infringement of state sovereignty that human rights institutions or human rights actions might involve. And our panel this afternoon is going to explore China's engagement with the international human rights regime and the interactions between the EU and China in this context. And I'm hoping that our panel will address a number of key questions about how China contributes to or seeks to shape the international human rights regimes. How does China respond if there are external actors who are critical of China's approach to human rights? And how has the EU sought to engage with China on human rights? And also, how does the EU actually balance a kind of constructive engagement approach with China with possible diplomatic or economic pressure because of human rights violations? And are there any kind of conclusions that can be drawn for the future development of global human rights? And we're fortunate this afternoon to have a number of experts on our panel, and I'm going to introduce them all now. And we'll do that in the order in which they're going to speak. So first of all, we have Professor Eva Pills. Eva is a professor of law at King's College in London. She's an affiliated scholar at the US Asia Law Institute of New York University Law School and an external member of the Center for Human Rights, Erlangen-Nuremberg. She studied law, philosophy, and sinology in Heidelberg, London, and Beijing, and she holds a PhD from UCL. And at King's, she's taught public law in the LLB program, courses on human rights, law and society in China, authoritarianism and populism, and the law on the LLM program. And before joining King's some 10 years ago, Eva was an associate professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law. And her research addresses autocratic conceptions and practices of governance, legal and political resistance, transnational repression, and forms of complicity with autocratic wrongs. And she's previously worked on human rights defense in China in a variety of contexts, including criminal justice, freedom of expression and association, and wider issues of access to justice. And then we have Professor Julie Yu Wen Chen. She's Professor of Chinese Studies at the Faculty of Arts in the University of Helsinki. She serves as one of the editors of the Journal of Chinese Political Science. And from 2023 up to next year, 2025, she's in the EU Twinning Project, the EU in the volatile Indo-Pacific region, where she's leading the preparatory research and providing supervision and counseling to the junior researchers in the project. She's formerly held academic positions at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, with ourselves in UCC in Ireland, and also with Academia Sinica in Taiwan. She's a visiting scholar at La Trobe University in Australia, the University of Virginia in USA, University of Tokyo, University of Tübingen, University of Nottingham, and the University of Macau, as well as St. Petersburg State University in Russia. 2011, she provided testimony in the public hearing of the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission on China's foreign policy challenges and players in Washington. And she's published in a number of leading peer-reviewed academic journals. And then lastly, we have Dr. Rana Siu Inbodin, who's a senior fellow with the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. And she serves as a consultant on human rights, democracy, and rule of law projects in Asia for a number of NGOs, and she conducts research related to international human rights, Chinese foreign policy, and the effectiveness of international human rights and democracy projects on authoritarian collaboration in the UN. And her first book, China and the International Human Rights Regime, which was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press, examines China's role in the international human rights regime between over a 35-year period from 1982 to 2017. And she's previously served in the US State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, where her primary responsibilities included managing the State Department's Human Rights and Democracy Fund China program, and also promoting US human rights and democracy policy in China and North Korea. And she served in the US consulate in Shanghai and in the office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs, and in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where she covered US-China relations. So a very warm welcome to all our panelists. And what I'd like to do is for our speakers each to present for between 15 and 20 minutes, and I'll appear at about 19 minutes, just as a reminder that your time is almost up. And then following the presentations, we'll have a Q&A. Now, members of the audience, and a very warm welcome to you. You're welcome to put questions in the chat, and I can then put those to the panelists. But when we turn to the Q&A, I'm also very happy for people to put up their virtual hands on Teams and ask questions in that way. So I'm hoping it'll be a very fruitful discussion this afternoon on an incredibly important series of topics. Just in terms of housekeeping, if people keep themselves muted and keep their cameras off, that would be appreciated, aside from obviously the speakers, just to improve bandwidth. But obviously, if you are asking a question in the Q&A, by all means, put your camera on and obviously unmute yourself as well. And that, I think, concludes my introduction. So I'm now very happy to turn to Professor Eva Pilz to begin the seminar with her presentation. Eva, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted to be able to speak to you about a topic that is at the absolute heart of my research interests, and that, as you just said, Mark, is, I think, a really important topic. Now, the way I'm hoping to do this, and I hope you will bear with me, is I would like to, after maybe introducing a few snapshots, spend a little bit of time talking about what kind of system we are encountering in the EU when engaging with China. And in that sense, sort of talk a little bit about how the human rights situation in China has developed on the ground, which is where I used to do a lot of research, especially when access to China was easier. And then talk about the global dimensions of human rights in China. And very broadly speaking, the thesis, the point that I would like to make is that, in a sense, we really should no longer think about human rights in China as an issue confined to China. In that sense, it is always human rights beyond China as well. And so just to introduce this topic, I guess that one of the first issues that these days, over the past couple of years, has been coming to people's minds when thinking about human rights in China is actually the issue of human rights, systemic and very widespread violations of human rights in its westernmost region, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and the atrocities there. And so that, of course, is something that has been very widely discussed, and made perhaps most of all the so-called vocational training camps, which in fact are camps for internment of very large numbers of people. And that's a human rights issue. It's also an international criminal law issue. And then there is, of course, the issue of human rights defenders, of people who work as advocates, as lawyers, as it could be journalists or indeed academics and so on, to defend typically the rights of others, but all too often in China. And this is something that it's always sort of important to keep in mind, each other's human rights, because human rights defenders themselves tend to become victims of violations. So to give one example, that of lawyer Yu Wensheng, well, he is one of the brave lawyers who stood up for instance, constitutional values, constitutional rights, and the principles of constitutionalism as the idea that the power of the state must be limited, and really paid a very heavy price for his advocacy more than once. Most recently, he was actually detained on his way to the EU delegation in Beijing. So, of course, these domestic issues also always have a kind of international dimension. And then thinking about human rights in China, of course, we are very much driven to consider China's international relations with the EU, where the fact that, for example, China is, of course, a really important trading partner has created all sorts of difficulties and issues in recent years, perhaps a little bit more about that later. But then also both the EU and China, of course, interact within global governance mechanisms such as those of the UN. And I think many will be familiar with the now so widely used phrase that China is three things at the same time for the EU. It is a strategic partner, it is a competitor, but it is also something that the EU now calls a systemic rival. So and then lastly, of course, there are those issues and instances where human rights kind of figures in EU-China relations, such as, for instance, when today Brussels raided, as the Financial Times reports, raided a Chinese security equipment supplier, and of course was promptly challenged on this action. And this is sort of maybe an example of human rights issues raised a little bit more indirectly in EU-China relations. Now, when talking about human rights, I will consistently try to refer to this as an idea of essentially norms protecting against abuses, but of course also as a set of norms captured partially in international treaties where they are very widely contested. One of those treaties, importantly, is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China has signed but has not yet ratified. We have been waiting for a very long time by now. Importantly, from the EU side, of course, there are many further treaty norms that are relevant to what the EU does in terms of human rights. And I think it is important also to note that the Treaty on the European Union itself in Article 21 stipulates pretty wide-ranging, we might say, ambitions for how the EU should act internationally, in particular this idea that the EU has a mission to advance human rights and related principles in the wider world. And on that basis, I guess that we should ask ourselves how China domestically as a system has evolved to, and this is a claim I would want to make, give some recognition to human rights, understood along the lines I just outlined, in its own system of governance. And this happened, of course, only in the post-Mao era, that is to say, from the 1980s onwards. When China starts recognizing human rights, including some of these international human rights law norms, it does so without, however, discarding the norms of the system that it had developed in the 3 decades under Mao Zedong. And so we are looking from the outset at a system that incorporates many tensions and contradictions. One of them, the fact that according to its own constitution, it is a so-called people's democratic dictatorship on the one hand, but then on the other hand also a country that is supposed to be governed on the basis of law. And that, of course, that tension has produced has had very important consequences for specific human rights, as they have been to some extent recognized and yet also continue to be systematically violated in the Chinese system. So we could think of the right to liberty, for example, the right not to be unlawfully detained or tortured, as an example where, in one sense, really, I think, and this is important, we can see that from the 1980s onwards, there are steps being taken, such as, for instance, the introduction of criminal procedure law rules to protect this right. And yet, on the other hand, there's also continued systematic violations. And what lawyers with whom I've interacted for so many years have consistently said is that no doubt these rules have made some difference for the better, because at least they have given us something to use to hold against the state on behalf of our clients when trying to defend them. But on the other hand, of course, they have also led to all kinds of practices of circumvention and abuse. And since the time is very short, I will not sort of say much about other types of human rights, socioeconomic rights, civil and political rights. It is perhaps pretty obvious that as a dictatorship, a self-described people's democratic dictatorship, as an authoritarian system, China does not protect freedom of expression. And that affects also the work of people trying to speak up, be it on their own behalf or on behalf of others, for human rights. And consequently, the situation of advocates in particular, of people trying to defend rights, for example, in the criminal process, has persistently been extremely challenged. I would love to talk more about that and give more examples of the individuals in China who have, by now for decades, tried to sort of work with the norms they have and the institutions they have to try and promote human rights causes. But the main point perhaps to make about these figures is that I think you could argue that they have presented important internal challenges to the system, which is, in a sense, we could say, why, when over 10 years ago, Party General Secretary and President Xi Jinping comes into power in late 2012, early 2013, he kind of doubles down on systematic violation of human rights, on repression, on denial of accountability for human rights violations, and combines that with a much strengthened, much more assertive discourse about the specific nature of the party-state system. And in particular, and this is, for example, the content of a constitutional reform revision in 2018 on the principle of party leadership, which I would very much want to argue is really in inherent tension with successful human rights protection. Hence, the increase in human rights violations with which I started. An example for that, of course, remains, unfortunately, Xinjiang. An example for that is also crackdowns on human rights defenders in domestic Chinese society. And of course, all of that, all of that naturally triggers a lot of concern internally in China, but then also from a global, so-called international community, which by the time Xi Jinping has sort of consolidated his new policies, is also in many ways challenged as a global community, undergoing a wave of autocratization, of autocratic consolidation in countries like China, and the decline and corrosion of liberal democracy elsewhere. And it is against that background that I think we nowadays have to sort of think about China's engagement on human rights issues with the global community within the UN and so forth. And again, sort of sadly skipping a very interesting speech by the then foreign minister, I would just want to say that of course, in contending with, as it were, the international community, China is in many ways on the defensive, but it has been, sadly from my perspective, very remarkably successful in developing strategies and discourses and techniques that have allowed it to defend itself fairly successful. I will not to say defend itself well, but to defend itself successfully against criticism and advocacy from other countries and transnational civil society. So how does it do that? If we look to the UN, I would say that there are some arguments that China uses that seem very familiar. So, for instance, this idea that as a developing country, China needs to prioritize poverty alleviation before it can get round to, say, implementing civil and political rights. The argument also that there are culturally specific norms that ought to be respected by other societies. And then perhaps even more familiar, the argument that there are national security concerns. Think Xinjiang, which is portrayed as a site of essentially anti-terrorism measures having to be taken to deal with an existential threat to the nation. There are strategies beyond these arguments, which, from my perspective, most successfully often consist in very simple, straightforward denials. So, for example, when the Xinjiang camps were developed for a number of years, the Chinese government was simply denying that these camps existed. And when that denial became impossible, the Chinese government said, well, yeah, there are camps, but they are for voluntary vocational training. In other words, it denied that human rights violations in the form of deprivation of liberty were actually taking place there. And so that is one sort of dimension of how we experience China's global engagement with the international human rights law regime. But of course, that's sort of the dimension of governance mechanisms like those of the UN, which are essentially mechanisms for monitoring and one might say not much more. Yet, if we want to think beyond those institutions, beyond Geneva, and think about how else, what other human rights implications we need to consider when thinking about China's interaction with the world. Well, I have to say that one sort of very important issue is one where perhaps the member states of the European Union and the European Union itself, shall we say, look less pure than in other contexts, and complicity with human rights violations such as labor rights violations through the existence of value chains, of course, have the tendency to implicate host countries, including those of the European Union, in these violations. We can talk about it, but I would say that attempts to deal with that by creating legislation to limit imports of goods thus affected have so far been really limited. There is, as another dimension of China's sort of global interactions, what many scholars and commentators refer to as China's long arm. So what does that mean? Well, if you think again about the broader context of criminal justice, there are quite ambitious global law enforcement campaigns that the Chinese government has instituted. And these involve the repatriation of fugitives, sometimes through extradition, which is the kind of lawful which is kind of the lawful mechanism to use, but other times through what the government calls persuasion to return, which is a kind of circumvention of extradition mechanisms which I should say have become harder for China to use because human rights courts, such as the European Court of Human Rights, have decided that China, due to its violations in the criminal justice system, is not actually suitable as a country to extradite people to. And then sometimes, and I would say I will not go into this because of time, but sometimes there are sort of contexts such as academic exchange, our engagement with Chinese partners and students and so on, where you could say that there's a little bit of the long arm and also some complicity. Now, I would say that sort of thinking about how the EU has dealt with this, importantly, the attitude, this idea that China is a problematic partner is relatively new, and for decades, the assumption, which we can I think also see reflected in the Treaty on European Union, Article 21, which I quoted, was really that China would gradually sort of become more like a liberal democracy, or at least more human rights respecting. That hasn't worked, and in the wake of China's rise and rising economic clout and so on and so forth, we can indeed even see that the European member states have become increasingly disunited when it has come to taking action against China's human rights violations, for instance, in context of the UN. And so, broadly speaking, that's the background for this more complex attitude that the European Union is taking as of today, which I mentioned earlier on. I think it is a bit of an improvement But there is a very big but from my perspective, because I think that for one thing, we can certainly see that there are many instances where human rights violations by the Chinese government have global implications, including in the EU, where the EU and its member states are simply unable really to deal with that. There is also that risk of complicity that I mentioned. But then lastly, and I haven't made this point yet, I also think that increasingly in our engagement with China, there's a risk of what some scholars like to call securitization, this idea that China is increasingly almost exclusively seen as a threat, or it is seen as a threat without differentiating between the Chinese government and its society and all the many actors within it, of cultivating a kind of friend-enemy discourse, which I, for one, really think is very problematic. So I would really conclude by saying that, of course, whatever we do to try and protect human rights and respond to the Chinese government's human rights violations, we need to do that in a way that is mindful of our own human rights obligations. Also, when we try to go after certain perpetrators of violations. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed, Eva. I mean, that's an excellent and very thought-provoking presentation. So we'll hold fire just now on questions and move to Professor Julie Chen. So Julie, thanks. I can see your slides there. So please, over to you.
So can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you. Can hear you fine.
And can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, they're not in slideshow though. So yeah, if you absolutely,
okay.
that's ideal. Thank you, Julie.
So hello everybody. Thank you for coming to have an important discussion on the human rights issues. I actually have been listening to Eva's presentation through our Finnish China Law Center at the University of Helsinki, and I'm very happy today that I'm able to be in the same panel with her. And I have to admit, I'm not a legal expert and not a human rights activist at all. My previous record was I have been doing research about the Uyghur issue and ethnic minority issues for several years, but I have to say the past 8 years has been very difficult for me to continue in that direction. So I have strategically kind of moved away from it, although sometimes I still discuss China's religious freedom kind of in relation to ethnic minority rights, because a lot of ethnic minorities, their religious freedom to practice what they believe is also being restricted. Yeah, but in today's discussions, I thought I want to do something different from the issues of minorities, but rather to look at the EU and China human rights dialogue. I think Eva already mentioned briefly about this mechanism. I want to explain what I want to talk about this. First of all, my intention is to look at the diplomacy behind this dialogue, and then to look critically at the actors that have been able to get involved in part of this dialogue, particularly legal experts who have academic training, but who also have a practical experience of getting involved in part of this human rights dialogue. And my own interest is to look at how themselves look at the situation and their participation, and in connections is some kind of reflection upon themselves. You know, how can they operate in such a very politically sensitive environment and still advocate for the things that they believe in? So let me begin with a bit of structure of my presentation. I will talk a bit about the background of this EU-China human rights dialogue. And then I will talk about basically the general structures of this dialogue and the mechanisms that are aimed to make it work. And then I will move on to the assessment of this dialogue, and then end with my conclusions, basically sharing a bit of my current research, my ideas. They are not very mature yet, but perhaps that can spark some discussion after my presentation. So the background, I think we can make it very simple like this. Basically, there is a before 1989, 1989, and after 1989. And I think most of you here know what happened in 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the crackdown on student protesters. Sorry, can you hear me well?
Yes, it's fine. I think our third speaker has just joined. I'll just mute her just now.
Okay.
Yeah. So please go on, Julie.
Yeah. So 1989, I think, is the watershed that internationally there were a lot of attention, media report about what happened in Tiananmen Square. But before 1989, to be honest, from what I can find in the current literature, I feel like there is a gap. Although, you know, before 1989, surely there were also different kinds of human rights violations. But you might recall in the 1970s when when the West was gradually trying to embrace China and bring China back to the international community. United States make a breakthrough by setting up diplomatic relations with PRC. So in that kind of atmosphere, in fact, there were not that many reports about China's human rights violations. In fact, there was a study done by Philip Baker kind of long time ago, and then he looked at about 4 or 5 years before 1989, within the European foreign policy documents, he only could find 4 documents that talk about China's human rights situation. One was related to Taiwan, another related to Tibet, and then the other 2 about the mass executions of Chinese Catholic priests. So that was like 4 or 5 years before 1989. There were not a lot of discussion, but 1989 changed everything. And of course, after 1989, the international community understood we have to address the issue. So even within Europe, the predecessors of the European Union, there was an arms embargo, a sanction on China, and also the United States had the sanctions. Until today, the arms embargo is still there. And there has been a lot of discussion whether and how to lift the arms embargo. So this is the background. But what I want to mention is because of this 1989 events, it brings the China's human rights issue to the international spotlight. And inevitably, the various international actors start to think how to and where to properly address the issue and make some meaningful changes. So this comes to my next slide. So basically, in the beginning, perhaps the opportunity was more at the EU forum, where there was the Commission on Human Rights, and also there's a subcommission on the prevention of discrimination and protection of minorities, where Western countries can bring up the issue and push for a co-sponsoring of international resolutions about China's problems. At that time, there were few alternatives for China because China was not involved in major international human rights treaties. And so so we are focusing on the EU today. The European Union members, every year they have to kind of push for, lobby each other to co-sign or co-sponsor the international resolutions. And the Chinese, of course, they didn't like the situations, so they try to propose other ways to kind of minimize the effect and minimize the international attention. So the Chinese were kind of pushing for so-called human rights dialogue, meaning that we could conduct a closed-door, top-level diplomatic dialogue on both sides' human rights situations, but this is not going to be, there is not going to be any international resolution signed. And in fact, 1995 was a very interesting year where the European Union members were still trying to co-sponsor international resolutions at the UN level, but at the same time, they were already trying to experiment with this other alternative, which is to have human rights dialogues with China. And the setup of this human rights dialogue is as follows. There are 3 levels. First is the top diplomatic level, and what we normally call track 1 diplomacy. And then there's a middle level, which is more interesting for professors, for scholars, and also for civil society NGO activists to meet. And then there is a last level, which is called cooperation projects. Basically, it could be sponsored by governments or also private foundations to carry out certain human rights improvement projects or empowerment projects in China. The question, though, is that although there are these 3 levels, so the first one seems to be like a track 1 diplomacy, very classified level, while the second one and the third one seems to be what we call track 1.5 or track 3, track 2 diplomacy. However, it was not very clear whether these 3 levels have any meaningful links and whether there is really a design that, for instance, whatever is carried out on the second level will be delivered to the top level discussions. And in fact, even among the participants, the Chinese participants and the European participants, they could not even agree on whether, for instance, participating in a legal seminar, whether that will whether they will deliver political recommendations to the top level to have further discussion and further implementation. So there are schisms between within the European, within the Chinese, and also both sides, and which leads to this issue. So if I assess the effectiveness of these human rights dialogues, from what I can gather, I feel that most experts and people who have been involved in this feel that this dialogue was not successful. And so the links and effects between the 3 levels were not clear. And even the Chinese side, particularly, they were really against the participation of NGO activists. The European side, of course, they hope that they could invite human rights activists specialized in China to participate. But this has been obstructed by the Chinese side several times. And while it seems that the academics were having a bit more leeway in participating in the legal seminar. And what I find very interesting as a political scientist and as somebody very interested in diplomacy is that there has also been written evidence about the Chinese obstruction in this kind of dialogue. It seems that the Europeans have made really a concession in the end. They didn't go through this UN forum to co-sponsor international resolution, but rather agree with the Chinese side to have the dialogue, which seems to be more peaceful. And however, the Chinese side didn't make it really smooth. For instance, in discussions, if anybody, particularly the European side, if anybody have mentioned trigger words, for instance, words like Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, immediately the Chinese side could use very harsh manners to stop that person from talking, shouting at them. These are all evidences that I have gathered. And there is also this very interesting time-wasting tactics. So basically, the Chinese side can just recite something, somebody's daily life from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, which is very meaningless in this kind of discussion, but to kill the time, and then so that there's nothing can be discussed. And another tactic is the Chinese side would like to propose always to discuss or to have the meeting before European holidays, such as Easter or Christmas holidays. And then eventually, the Chinese side even managed to reduce the meetings from twice per year to once per year. So diplomatically, it seems that the Chinese side, I think they have made breakthrough to make sure that this kind of events are meaningless. And this is exactly what they wanted to do. However, from what I can gather from sources, interestingly, there are also self-reflections from legal experts who were involved in the legal seminar. They feel that the European side also partly has to blame themselves for particularly their problematic pedagogical approach towards the Chinese counterparts. I will give you an example of what I mean by this. And in fact, I just want to show you this website that me and my colleague Jessica, she's also here today. I see her in the seminar, that we have been conducting oral histories interviews with very senior China experts in Nordic countries. And that include not just professors, but also people who are kind of in the quasi-academic arena. Sometimes they are involved in human rights advocacy. Some of them are journalists, but they also have some academic affiliations. Very interestingly, actually, this part, if you look at this picture, these are all the experts from Denmark. the male ones were interviewed by me. And so you can see in the early days, all the China experts in Nordic countries, they are also dominated a lot by males. But then there are slightly younger generations, younger scholars, the female ones. And Dusita, she actually conducted the interview with the female ones. I make a circle in my PowerPoint slide of this scholar, Hatla Taylor. So Dusita conducted interview with her, and I further had a conversation with her not long ago about her experience of participating in this legal seminar. And in fact, the institute that she worked for is called the Danish Institute of Human Rights. They were tasked for a period of time to help the EU conduct this so-called legal seminar. So this is what she said, and as the evidence of why she thinks there's a problematic European approach towards the Chinese in this meeting. I'm not going to read everything, but I kind of marked some sentences in red color. So she was very upset by the attitudes of Europeans during these sessions. And sometimes she said there are participants who did not know anything about China, but they come in the discussion with a superior attitude and sometimes have a very biased picture of China. And for instance, she said lawyers or sociologists from different European countries, they were coming to meet the Chinese counterparts with such arrogance. And they know China was such a horrible country, this kind of thing. So in fact, in her reflection of what happened, she thought that this was not a very conducive atmosphere for any kind of genuine discussion. And to be honest, the Chinese side, when they send people to participate in the legal seminar, the people they send are usually scholars. So they are not the government officials who carry out the terrible violations. But they are scholars who actually understood a lot of legal norms and wish to have conversation. But you can imagine if they come into a meeting where the other side kind of look down on them and feel that they have to be taught something. So this kind of atmosphere was not conducted for genuine dialogue. A bit of conclusion here is, of course, the Chinese side diplomatically also try to exploit the EU disunity, because the European member states, some of them have a stronger commercial interest. And as time passed by, nobody remember what happened in 1989 anymore, not everybody. So some member states deprioritize human rights. And with this disunity, China can easily exploit it. So while the EU always feel that it is a normative power, sorry for my mistake on the PowerPoint, it is not normal power, but normative power. EU is strong as a normative power in certain areas, but I think when it comes to China's human rights situation and how to make meaningful changes, actually EU manifests a very weak normative power. And these are the materials that I have studied, and most of the people here, they have experience with being a scholar, but also participated in those dialogue. I think after 2009, slowly this kind of dialogue is being concentrated and being carried out, implemented by the European External Action Service. So there are also recent papers that interview those diplomats, both based in Beijing and in Brussels, and how they look at it. However, I think overall the conclusion from what I can read, people who write about it feel that this dialogue has not really moved to anything meaningful. And unfortunately, my own interest here, though, and this is where I kind of will conclude my presentation here, is that, as I mentioned, I'm very interested in those scholars who have the practical experience and getting involved in this really high-level dialogues. And my question is, to what extent, because in a way, by participating in the discussions, they produce some kind of images of China, they narrate about China, and particularly about China's practice of human rights. But I'm very interested to know, to what extent they have to self-censor themselves. For instance, when I talked to Hatla Taylor recently, I asked her about the self-censorship. She mentioned even, for instance, her institute, the Danish Institute of Human Rights, they have refrained from inviting Dalai Lama simply because they know if they have done this, the Chinese side will stop talking to them. And this is not what they want, because they want to continue to have engagement with real Chinese actors. And they believe that some Chinese actors, despite they are small, but they do have certain influences in their society to address certain issues. So in fact, there has been self-censorship by even these scholar practitioners. And I think I leave it like that now. In more recent years, and I think Ava mentioned this as well, is that I think the space for even this kind of dialogue and for meaningful international exchanges is being shrinked because of Xi Jinping's policy, and also because, in fact, Xi Jinping is also securitizing this kind of international cooperation, very often framed as a foreign influences. And once you are being framed in this way, you are kind of over. So my colleague here, Dusita, maybe she can share her view later on. She worked a lot on the women's rights issues. And if you are being seen as connected to the global Me Too movement, then it's a foreign influences, and then you cannot operate. So even for women's movements, there was a high time that they have more space to operate when China was trying to hope that the world can forgive them and let them participate in international forum. So women had a bit more space to participate in the UN forum. But in Xi's era, I think things has become more difficult. Even women's movement, if it's connected to Me Too or feminist movement, this could be seen as a foreign interference or foreign influences. So I think I will leave my presentation here, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Julie. An excellent presentation, very, very interesting indeed, and I'm sure there will be follow-up questions. So our third speaker, Dr. Rana Inboden, has joined us. I did introduce you actually at the outset in the hope that you were going to join us, so I won't introduce you again, but I'm really pleased that you are here. So over to you, and you have between 15 20 minutes to present. I've made you a presenter if you do have PPT as well, Rana.
Okay, I am so sorry that I was late. With the time change in the US, my computer did not spring ahead properly, and so it pinged me at the wrong time. But I'm especially sad that I was a little late because I always learn things from Professor Eva Pills. And Julie, Professor Chen, I appreciated what you had to say. I think our scholarship is actually quite complementary. So I do apologize. I think I'm best prepared to talk about two of the questions that were posed here, which is that how does China contribute to or shape the international human rights regime? And where external actors or UN institutions are critical of China, how does China respond? A relevant point is that when I pursued my dissertation, which formed the bulk of the research for my book, I asked very openly, what role does China play in the international human rights regime? My dissertation research concluded in 2017, and while I did not find that China was a destructive force, in none of my case studies did I find that China was cited by anybody as strengthening or building up the human rights regime. I think it's an important point to say that stopping my dissertation in 2017 was actually a good inflection point, because it's after that that we see a very different China emerging. And thankfully, I've continued to do research, some article-length work in other publications, and I've been able to outline ways that China shifted to a much more muscular, assertive posture. I'd also be extremely remiss if I did not say that during this same time, under Xi Jinping, we have seen a mushrooming of domestic repression that has led to the Wei-Tran movement human rights lawyers, who are human rights lawyers, being kidnapped, arbitrarily detained, disappeared. Some of the accounts of what has happened to them is truly horrific. Hong Kong dissenters having bounties placed on their heads after they flee to seek asylum in other countries, and then the mass arbitrary detention of Uyghurs. Over 1 million Uyghurs have now been detained in re-education camps. And I don't think these things, the domestic repression and the external behavior of China, I think there's a strong linkage between the two. So it's not a mistake. So I will start with saying that I have seen China introducing a lot of Chinese-isms or Shiisms into the narrative in the Human Rights Council. And some of these ideas sound vague or initially innocuous, but I think they embody concepts that imperil a robust human rights system. China first started this with talking about cooperation and dialogue in the 1990s, and this is where some of my findings mesh nicely with Professor Chen's findings with regard to China saying that we should only pursue quiet dialogue. China also started calling resolutions in the commission confrontational, and so I think China saw that in the 1990s. Injecting ideas and phrases into the human rights, into the international human rights conversations was actually very effective in silencing critics. So what I have seen happen more recently is that China has, since 2017, we've seen that China is employing this same strategy, but in a much more concerted effort. So China now, in order to shift from a defensive posture where it's merely trying to prevent other countries from raising China, it has gone to a more offensive posture where it's actually trying to change the international human rights regime. And I'll say, for example, some of these phrases that initially sound harmless really do undermine robust human rights scrutiny at an international level. So, for example, China has introduced the idea of win-win cooperation or mutually beneficial cooperation. And, you know, it's hard to say I don't believe in cooperation. Nobody who works in foreign policy would say I don't believe in cooperation. But what China is actually conveying in this is that in order for other countries, in order to benefit from China's largesse and kind of not get on China's bad side, they have to cooperate with China and kind of support some of China's ideas and can't criticize China. So I think in essence, this focus on cooperation means that only China wins and that other states have to comply with China's vision and approach. The cooperation China envisions is mainly just between states. China does not see a role for NGOs, tries to delegitimize them and keep them out of the international human rights regime. And we know from scholarship that human rights organizations play an incredibly important role. I also think that if you think about win-win cooperation, if states are cooperating or states cooperate with China, then who loses? The victims are human rights, people who have suffered horrible human rights violations and have no form of redress. And so I think that China really seeks to use its growing power, political and economic power, to convince other countries that the best way forward is to cooperate with China and not to allow individuals to have a floor in the human rights regime. I would also say that another Chinese term is community of common destiny or community of shared future. These are translations of the same term, but what I would say is that this really means it's a way for the PRC to overemphasize mutual cooperation again, but also say that it's in essence, it's a way to turn to convince countries we have to be bound by this same Chinese shared vision, and that the only way forward is to kind of align with the PRC. So I think the message to other states is that in order to realize and gain from this beneficial common destiny, they cannot challenge the CCP, cannot raise concerns about human rights violations, in China. China has also introduced the right to development in the human rights regime. And of course, we're all for development and poverty alleviation. But I think the problem here is that China seeks to flood the human rights regime, especially the Human Rights Council discussions, with a focus on the right to development, which leaves almost no space to talk about torture, arbitrary detention, and the rights of ethnic minorities. And there are other UN mechanisms and fora that are designed to focus on development. I will also say that one very troubling trend that I've seen is the development of what I call authoritarian collaboration. I've seen that China and other countries like Russia work together. In Geneva, in the Human Rights Council, this comes in the form of what is called the like-minded group. It's a term that a group of countries came up with themselves. And what they really are like-minded about is they seem to be wanting to hold back the strengthening of the human rights regime. Not all of these countries are necessarily as autocratic or totalitarian as China or Russia, but they do seem to be intent on aligning with China's focus on a right to development, trying to reduce the ability to scrutinize individual countries for their rights abuses. And that's important because I think rights abuses very often occur along national lines. And I would also say that this vague sounding name it is intentional, and they also, I think, it's intentional because this is a diplomatic phrase that is used very often, and so it's hard to sort of pin down, or say like we shouldn't be like-minded about particular things. But these countries also seem to be bound by a shared sense of solidarity. Global South solidarity, where they feel that the West has been unfairly critical of the developing world, and they claim that a lot of the country-specific resolutions that were introduced in the Commission, which is the body that preceded the Human Rights Council, and in the Human Rights Council itself, that the Western industrialized democracies are much too critical of the developing world. And the LMG, what's interesting is I saw the LMG being very active in the 1990s. They emerged in the late 1990s. They were active through about 2005, 2006. That's when the Human Rights Council was created. The Human Rights Council's composition favored the Global South, some of these Global South countries, because there was a shifting of the geographical dispersion of seats in the Human Rights Council compared to the Commission. And so what happened is around 2006, these countries, sort of the like-minded group went kind of dormant or went on a hiatus. But then what happened is around 2011, 2012, the Human Rights Council started becoming more vigorous, and that was very intentional. A number of Western democracies took more seriously focusing on certain rights abuses, countries like Libya, Syria, and there was also a much more concerted effort by the liberal democracies to push for the UN to focus on what is called the reprisals report, where they started to look at the countries that are kind of, if an individual from that country goes to Geneva or reports to the UN human rights abuses or engages with human rights mechanisms, we have seen that in certain countries they face reprisals, punishment, detention, and worse. And so this reprisals report is now an annual UN Secretary General report. And the like-minded group did not like this, and they saw a strengthening of scrutiny. And so you see them reemerge, and you see China playing a much more concerted effort in this group. And it's not just a group in name only. They marshal votes, they marshal statements. So when each country comes under review during the periodic review process, which happens about every like 4.5 years, where each country is reviewed, they try to recruit each other to make positive statements. So China was so successful in getting some of these countries to sign up that during the UPR that China underwent just a couple of months ago, so over 100, I think 130 countries had signed up, which left only about 40 to 50 seconds for every country to make a statement. And so the countries that really wanted to express concerns about Hong Kong or the detention of Uyghurs had to kind of really condense their statements, whereas you saw a number of China's allies kind of either offering praise or just very vague platitudinous statements or asking China to share more lessons. Watching that UN webcast is fascinating, but you'll see that it really seemed to be an eating up time sort of exercise. And the LMG has protected other countries as well. So it's not just a China defense mechanism. They have tried to resist scrutiny for countries like Syria, Yemen, Russia. They are also trying to kill any rights-friendly initiative, any real initiatives or resolutions that are meant to be highly protective of individuals or scrutinize countries. They will try to weaken or eliminate. They'll use what is called hostile resolutions to do that. And they're also putting forward their own resolutions. I think one of the fascinating, though troubling things is that since 2017, before that, China did not offer its own resolutions in the Human Rights Council. And since then, we have seen China come up with resolutions. I think now we're up to about 5 or 6 resolutions that China championed, and it was able to secure passage of these resolutions because of the support of the like-minded group. I know that I'm running low on time, so I'll try to mention that I also see some other very troubling signs with regard to rhetorical pushback and challenges to mechanisms. So China will threaten other countries whenever somebody is critical of China. So I'm getting to the second question about how does China respond to criticism? So historically, I think it was 1997 when Denmark sponsored the resolution in the Commission on Human Rights, and China said that in retaliation it would keep Denmark out of its domestic market, and that it would be like dropping a rock on the head of Denmark. China did the same thing when Liu Xiaobo, who died from cancer after being detained in China. The PRC, after he got the Nobel Peace Prize, the PRC kept Norwegian salmon exports out of its market. China will also be very, very critical of other countries as well, pointing to, like, for example, I think they point to even like Switzerland having human rights abuses if they don't like something that Switzerland said. And it really seems to be a tit for tat thing, not a genuine concern about what's going on in other countries. I will also say that one bright spot in the UN human rights system is the special procedures. These are independent experts, and they are not paid by the UN, and they retain their independence. And I think this is very important because they have been able to speak out. Since 2016, the special procedures have issued over 22 public statements on China expressing alarm and concern. Many of these statements were signed by multiple special procedures in some cases 40 or 50 mandate holders, and there are about 58 special procedures. So the fact that there were that many special procedures speaking collectively, I think is very important. I can tell that I'm low on time, so I will say that China, in response, started criticizing some of those special procedures by name, saying that they were unreliable and that they were tools of the West. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll also just briefly mention that I started my career as a US diplomat. And so if anybody has questions about the human rights dialogue and some of those exchanges, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks very much indeed, Rana. I mean, that was very interesting. So I'm happy to throw it open now to the floor for questions. I'm happy to take questions either orally. So if you want to raise your hand, please do that. Or if you want to put questions in the chat, please feel free. And Andrew, you're coming on there. Is that a prelude to a question? It is indeed. Okay. Please ask away.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of our presenters for very interesting presentations. I just wanted to ask about sanctions. You know, one of the arguments is that, you know, dialogue isn't effective. You know, using the UN isn't effective, you know, so then people come to the conclusion, is it time to get tough on China, but maybe other countries where there are serious human rights issues? So I don't know, you know, if any of you have any reflections on sanctions. Are they a sensible instrument? Are they ever effective, or are they as likely to just be counterproductive and not really improve anything? So any thoughts on comments on sanctions as an instrument, which, I mean, they have to varying degrees been tried by the EU and also the US vis-a-vis China. Thank you.
And shall we go in the order of the speakers? So maybe starting off with Eva and then Julie and Rana.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the question. Indeed, sanctions, I think, are very much sort of in fashion, you could say. And I think that this corresponds maybe to a move towards unilateral sort of instruments and tools being used within a broader context of international human rights law, because those mechanisms that were originally devised, as Rana and Ewan and Julie have shown, I think, are really under pressure. They're really under strain. And I think that when it comes especially to global human rights sanctions regimes, I personally would say that there's a lot of contention. From my perspective, even if we leave aside the issue of efficacy, which is always going to be very difficult to assess, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what are these sanctions for? And I would personally want to say that the best justification for them is somehow preventative, as sort of an attempt to signal to, well, ultimately the states of the individuals who are the direct targets of these sanctions, that there is sort of a kind of censure, and there is a hope of changing, of altering the behavior of the state. There's huge contention about that, because these sanctions are addressed to they target individual persons. They seem punitive. And so far as they are punitive, and I think that, you know, scholars differ in their views, they would, of course, need to, from a human rights perspective, comply with broader human rights and rule of law standards and requirements, which is difficult to achieve in a situation where ultimately it can be hard to identify perpetrators with the degree of sort of certainty that you would want, etc., etc. But then also beyond that, sort of the nature of sanctions issue, I would want to say that we can unfortunately observe that the more political the decision-making process is about imposing a sanction, the more political considerations, not really human rights related, will come into designating targets. And that is hugely problematic. It's problematic when, for example, we see that individual perpetrators, individuals in countries with which we happen to have really good relations, think maybe Saudi Arabia, are not targeted by sanctions. That seems problematic. And then, of course, the huge question, are we going after the low-level perpetrators because we dare not go after the really responsible political leaders? So lots and lots of problems there. I would say, as best, maybe these sanctions have a signaling function. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eva. Julie or Rana, do you want to comment on that?
The U.S. has imposed some sanctions, and I think sanctions are. I am pro sanctions. I think for decades the international community engaged in dialogue with China, and we've actually seen that human rights are now significantly worse. The U.S. passed the Uyghur Prevention Forced Labor Act that bars products that are suspected of being tainted with Uyghur forced labor from entering the U.S. market. The U.S. is in the middle of implementing that, and I've been in discussions or done research on the implementation, and I think people are very earnestly trying to do that. I think that's incredibly important. What we know about those re-education camps is truly horrific. People are beaten, women are raped. The people who survive those camps are often suicidal because of what they endured. And so I think it's very important to use that. I think that's a good broad sanction. The U.S. also has some mechanisms for individuals to sanction individuals. I think Eva touched on the difficulty of that, which is, sometimes it's low-level people. But I think if we do know we do know names. We know names of party secretaries who were in charge of the policies in Xinjiang, and so I think we should use those tools more. The number of individuals that the U.S. has sanctioned is very limited, and so they're barred. These people are barred from the United States. But I will also say, and maybe this is a very provocative thing to say, but I think that the judges who have overseen some of the trials of, for example, 2 Uyghurs who have life sentences merely for being professors of Uyghur culture and folklore, Rahil Dawah and Ilham Tohti, why not sanction the judges that oversaw those kangaroo courts? Same thing with the trial going on under Jimmy Lai. These kinds of repressive systems only work because people are willing to go along with it, even if ultimately the top level leadership is responsible.
Thanks, Rana. Julie?
Yeah, just very briefly, and actually we still have the arms embargo that hasn't been lifted after 1989. So I'm pro continuing the embargo, because even though some European countries have kind of violated it and sell arms to China, at this, if you leave it, there's a symbolic meaning, and you will kind of encourage the Chinese to maybe modernize its defense industry and destabilize the regional security and human rights violations. So even this kind of larger sanction, I think it still should be there in place. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And Eva, you wanted to come back with a comment.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Just to say very quickly, I think about sanctioning perpetrators. We should, if we hold ourselves to human rights standards, I think engage with the question of how much perpetrators in any given situation are also victims of the system they work in and for. And these can be very, very tricky questions, especially if we go after low-level people. And that's hard to deal with sanctions, but also regarding the issue of sort of value chains and projects from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. I guess that in my way of thinking, you know, Rana, that would be more an issue of avoiding complicity, avoiding making contributions of our own to this very great injustice. So I'm fully with you on that.
Okay, many thanks. We've got a question that's come into chat about Russia, North Korea, and China alliance. Is it a worry going forward? This is from Noel. I mean, obviously there is a kind of Russia-China axis at the moment. Whether North Korea is part of that, I mean, China has participated in sanctions in relation to North Korea. But Julie, do you maybe want to start on that?
Yes, it's not just the alliances is forming. I think there has been scholars doing research on this authoritarian, like, how do you say, imitations. So they imitate each other, how they can repress. So domestically, you see a lot of similarities. But now I hear twice from the two speakers, you talk about this transnational repression. And I think they are also doing the same, particularly in Europe. I'm aware of those three countries are doing the same, even assassinate, if not kidnap people, you know. And so this is worry train. Yeah.
Any other? Rana?
I agree. Yep. I very much agree. This is a worrying trend, but it's much bigger than Russia, North Korea, and China. Look up my research and look at the like-minded group and how big it is. In the late 1990s, it was like less than 30. I think last time I counted, it was almost 60. But I will also say that I wrote a National Endowment for Democracy report last summer that focused on authoritarian collaboration in the UN human rights system, largely focusing on Russia and China. And I think that is very worrying. So I would suggest looking at that. And I also have spoken and talked about ways that China will protect the DPRK in the UN. And so I think this mutual protection is very dangerous, but it's been going on for a while.
Thanks. Eva, do you want to come in?
Maybe just to add one sort of further complication to what I fully agree is a worrisome trend of sort of alliances between autocratic countries. I mean, I do think that we need to consider that some acts of transnational repression are perpetrated or kind of emanate from countries that are undergoing corrosion of their democratic systems. Think, for instance, India as a recent example. And I think that's a good and worrisome and really even more troubling indication that we're not looking at a kind of stable number of consolidated autocracies merely, but really also a world where autocratization is happening at different levels in different countries.
Yeah, no, thanks very much.
Sorry, I would also say that transnational repression means that countries like China and Russia are reaching into our own countries where people who have fled repression are now being targeted in the United States or in the UK. And so I think that's very, very worrisome.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, Rana, indeed. David has his hand up. David O'Brien, do you want to come in, David, please?
Hi, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. David O'Brien here from Jagiellonian University in Krakow, formerly of UCC, very proud UCC graduate. This is my second UCC event in 2 days. Yesterday I was at another online a film screening followed by a discussion which was organized by Julia Schneider at the School of Asian Studies there. And one of the guests at the presentation was Jawhar Ilham, who's the daughter of Professor Ilham Tohti, who Rana just mentioned. And I would like to ask, if I may, a slightly provocative question, given that UCC were very close to opening a joint campus with the Central Minzu University, which is the former university of Professor Ilham, and I'm wondering what the panelists might think in terms of, given what we know about the monitoring that was happening of Professor Ilham by the university and his students and the detention of his students, if we can, as universities, continue to have these collaborations up to and including joint campuses with universities who have also themselves significant human rights questions to answer. As I say, it's a provocative question, but I'm asking it anyway.
Thanks, David. Who would like to go first on that? Eva?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think in principle, I would recommend not. I think that there are very, very serious concerns, especially when it comes to collaborations where you create dependencies that can get you into extremely complex ethical conundrums further down the line. But having said that, I would also want to say that I'm really not in favor of sort of a kind of complete academic decoupling. I think that also brings huge problems. And I think we have to recognize, as you know, we're confronted with every day in the classroom, of course, interacting with people who are governed by autocratic systems when they come to us or we go there, etc., means interacting with people under pressure. And somehow we have to deal with that. And we have, in many settings, an obligation, as you suggest, I think, David, to sort of stand back, to sort of drop potentially very problematic projects. But in many other settings, we have a duty of care towards those who, you know, visit us, who study with us, etc. And it can get very, very complex.
Thanks, Eva. Any of the others? Julie, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would like to mention also, in fact, past few years at the EU level, there has been, I think, policy recommendations done in terms of this kind of international cooperations with Chinese counterparts, and various EU member states also issue their own principles or code of conduct. And I don't know if Ireland has this kind of document. Of course, in general, the university has the autonomy to decide what they want, but perhaps it's also wise to check this kind of a wider, larger level and see the recommendation and see if there's a violations of principles. Yeah.
Thanks, Ilana.
Thanks. Yes, given that China is now not merely authoritarian, it's totalitarian, I really don't think we should be doing business as usual with China. I agree with Eva. I don't want us to decouple. You know, early in my career and in graduate school, I was able to spend a significant amount of time in China. I think many of us who work on China benefited enormously from that. But I still think we should study China. I still think people should go there and study. I am extremely worried about programs that the CCP is able to control. And so when it's like the content is such that the Chinese government is able to control it, I'm very concerned about that. If you want to watch a rather amusing exchange, I testified before the Congressional Executive Commission on China in February, and a representative from Montana asked me about Montana accepting CCP-backed money. He did not want his university to accept it, but the university was going ahead with it, and so he asked for my advice. And it's a rather funny exchange, but I think that I expressed it very appropriately why we should be concerned about those programs.
Sure. I mean, there are obviously nuanced ways of going about this. I mean, you can avoid having joint programs. You can still have arrangements with Chinese universities which facilitate students coming here and vice versa. And obviously, I mean, Ireland does have, I mean, their human rights commitments through the National University of Ireland Charter, and I mean, they're built into agreements. So there are ways of managing the risk and avoiding the kind of the issues that Rana was kind of identifying, particularly there. There's one question in the chat which isn't directly about human rights, but just on the impact of US military aid to Taiwan. Would the military aid increase the threat from China? I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. Perhaps I know we're slightly over time. Maybe one of the panelists you might want to Julie. Yeah.
Well, you see, even there is no military aid from the United States, Taiwan still faces the same threat. That China still have the intention to, whatever you call it, unite or reunite with Taiwan one day. So what do you think? Actually, Taiwan has to defend itself, and that's what the government keeps saying. And if there is external help, all welcome.
Yeah. One of the things that hasn't come out of questions, although people may have questions on this, is that essentially, how does the EU deal with China? I mean, I think I think Julie, you maybe made the point about the EU's weak manifestation of normative power in this regard. I mean, how does the EU engage? And you also made a very interesting observation about how the EU delegation behaved in those meetings with China, which obviously would have soured the atmosphere hugely. So, I mean, maybe just from panelists, how should the EU engage with China around this? How do we structure our relations around human rights? Eva, do you want to take, or Rana, you've unmuted first there.
So, I mean, very quickly,
Eva,
yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I mean, I do think that fundamentally we need to realize that our relations have become more complicated. That's one thing. And I think that diplomacy is no longer the only or indeed the main channel we should be thinking about when thinking about our responsibility to sort of uphold human rights in EU-China relations. So a lot is about avoiding complicity. And I think there, for instance, value chains and things like that are really, really important. I think that there is, and of course, also we have these sort of obligations to respond to transnational repression, as just discussed. What I would perhaps add is that I think I see a kind of hopeful sign in the fact that within the institutions of the EU, we see a kind of more pluralism and more tension and contention about how we should engage with China. So a good example, I think, for that is the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which, as a result of European Parliament action, is stalled. And that's a reaction in turn to counter sanctions imposed by China. In other words, the European Parliament sees the connection between the trade and the human rights issues and sort of decides that it will not tolerate, it will not accept extremely repressive conduct on the part of the Chinese government, sort of just in the interests of a trade agreement. And I think that kind of differentiation and complication is something useful. It sort of ultimately reflects a kind of democratic debate.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to come in. Again, I'm conscious of time and people may need to leave, but Rana or Julie? Rana?
I'll say that I think that, not unlike my country, there's been some missteps by the EU, but I will say that in the late 1990s, China used economic pressure and incentives to break the EU as a bloc supporting the resolution in the UN Commission on Human Rights. I think that was extremely damaging. And then after that, you saw, and Julie kind of outlined it well, you saw like anemic human rights dialogue. More recently, some EU countries have been working in the UN. So we've seen a couple of joint statements with some EU countries and the US and other concerned countries. We also saw some countries put forward a 2022 resolution on the abuses going on in Xinjiang. I think these are good steps. I'm not against dialogue, but dialogue alone is not going to be sufficient. I think these forms of scrutiny are extremely valid and useful.
Okay, many thanks. Julie, do you want to add anything? Okay. I'm going to suggest that we wind up there. I'm conscious we've gone slightly over time, and I know people may have other commitments. So I'd like to thank our speakers very much indeed. Fantastic presentations, really thought-provoking, and some great questions from the audience as well. And also thanks to the Jean Monnet Centre and their project for facilitating this particular event, and to Roman Lieber for organisation of this, along with Professor Andrew Cottee. So many thanks indeed to everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it, and there will be a recording of the event, which I think will be potentially made available more widely. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. It's a very warm, sunny spring evening in Cork, surprisingly, which is nice. Spring arrived about 2 or 3 days ago. Anyway, again, thank you very much to our speakers, and I hope everyone enjoyed that. Take care for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.